Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are, whenever you are, whatever you are. Welcome to another edition of the Esoteric Podcast. In this episode, we will be looking at The Myth of Mental Illness by Thomas Szasz. This is something that has become a stigma and a label I've had to deal with most of my adult life, so during my researches over the past year, this has definitely resonated. I hope you'll enjoy this, and please bear with the obvious assumptions. And let's dive straight in. The aim of this essay is to raise the question, is there such a thing as mental illness, and to argue that there is not. Since the notion of mental illness is extremely widely used nowadays, inquiry into the ways in which this term is employed would seem to be especially indicated. Mental illness, of course, is not literally a thing or a physical object, and hence it can exist only in the same way as other theoretical concepts exist. Yet familiar theories are in the habit of posing sooner or later, as at least to those who come to believe in them, as objective truths or facts. During certain historical periods, explanatory conceptions such as deities, witches, or microorganisms appeared not only as theories but as self-evident causes of a vast number of events. Here it is submitted that today mental illness is widely regarded in somewhat of a similar fashion, that is, as a cause of innumerable diverse happenings. As an antidote to the complacent use of the notion of mental illness, whether as a self-evident phenomena, theory, or cause, let us ask the question, what is meant when it is asserted that someone is mentally ill? In what follows, Szasz describes briefly the main uses in which the concepts of mental illness has been put, and he argues that the notion has outlived whatever usefulness might have had, and that now functions merely as a convenient truth. Mental illness as a sign of brain disease. The notion of mental illness derives its main support from such phenomena as syphilis of the brain or delirious conditions, intoxication for instance, in which persons are known to manifest various peculiarities or disorders of thinking and behavior. Correctly speaking, however, these are diseases of the brain and not the mind. According to one school of thought, all so-called mental illness is of this type. The assumption is made that some neurological defect, perhaps a very subtle one, will ultimately be found for all the disorders of thinking and behavior. Many contemporary psychiatrists, physicians, and other scientists hold this view. This position implies that people cannot have troubles expressed in what are now called mental illnesses because of differences in personal needs, opinions, social aspirations, values, and so on. All problems in living are attributed to psychochemical processes which in due time will be discovered by medical research. Mental illnesses are thus regarded as basically no different than all other diseases, that is, of the body. The only difference in this view between mental and bodily diseases is that the former, affecting the brain, manifest themselves by means of mental symptoms, whereas the latter, affecting the organ systems, for example the skin or the liver, etc., manifest themselves by means of symptoms referable to those parts of the body. This view rests on and expresses what are, in Szasz's opinion, two fundamental errors. In the first place, what central nervous system symptoms would correspond to a skin eruption or fracture? It would not be some emotional or complex bit of behavior. Rather, it would be blindness or paralysis of some part of the body. The crux of the matter is that a disease of the brain, analogous to a disease of the skin or bone, is a neurological defect and not a problem in living. For example, a defect in a person's visual field may be satisfactorily explained by correlating it with certain defined lesions of the nervous system. On the other hand, a person's belief, whether this be a belief in Christianity, in communism, or in the idea that his internal organs are rotting and that his body is in fact already dead, cannot be explained by a defect or disease of the nervous system. Explanations of this sort of occurrence, assuming that one is interested in the belief itself and does not regard it simply as a symptom or expression of something else that is more interesting, must be sought along different lines. The second error in regarding complex psychosocial behavior consisting of communications about ourselves and the world around us as mere symptoms of neurological functioning is epistemological. In other words, it is an error pertaining not to any mistakes in observation motivation or reasoning such as, but rather to the way in which we organize and express our knowledge. In the present case, the error lies in making a symmetrical dualism between mental and physical or bodily symptoms, a dualism which is merely a habit of speech and to which no known observations can be found to correspond. Let us see if this is so. In medical practice, when we speak of physical disturbances, we mean either signs, for example a fever, or symptoms, for example pain. We speak of mental symptoms, on the other hand, when we refer to a patient's communications about himself, others, and the world around him. He may state that he is Napoleon or that he is being persecuted by the communists. These would be considered mental symptoms only if the observer believed that the patient was not Napoleon or that he was not being persecuted. This makes it apparent that the statement that X is a mental symptom involves rendering a judgment. The judgment entails, moreover, a covert comparison or matching of the patient's ideas, concepts, or beliefs with those of the observer and the society in which they live. The notion of mental symptom is therefore inextricably tied to the social, including ethical context in which it is made, in much the same way as the notion of bodily symptoms is tied to an anatomical and generic context. Thus far, Szasz has tried to show that for those who regard mental symptoms as a sign of brain disease, the concept of mental illness is unnecessary and misleading. For what they mean is that people so labelled suffer from disease of the brain, and if that is what they mean, it would seem better for the sake of clarity to say that and not something else. Mental illness as a name for problems in living. The term mental illness is widely used to describe something which is very different than a disease of the brain. Many people today take it for granted that living is an arduous process. Its hardship for modern man, moreover, derives not so much from a struggle for biological survival as from the stresses and strains inherent in the social intercourse of complex human personalities. In this context, the notion of mental illness is used to identify or describe some features of an individual's so-called personality. Mental illness, as a deformity of the personality, so to speak, is then regarded as the cause of the human disharmony. It is implicit in this view that the social intercourse between people is regarded as something inherently harmonious, its disturbance being due solely to the presence of mental illness in many people. This is obviously fallacious reasoning, for it makes the abstraction mental illness into a cause, even though this abstraction was created in the first place to serve only as a shorthand expression for certain types of human behavior. It now becomes necessary to ask what kinds of behavior are regarded as indicative of mental illness and by whom. The concept of illness, whether bodily or mentally, implies deviation from some clearly defined norm. In the case of physical illness, the norm is the structural and functional integrity of the human body. Thus, although the desirability of physical health as such is an ethical value, what health is can be stated in an anatomical and physical term. What is the norm deviation from which is regarded as mental illness? This question cannot be easily answered. But whatever the norm might be, we can be certain of only one thing, namely that it is a norm that must be stated in terms of psychosocial, ethical, and legal concepts. For example, notions such as excessive repression or acting out of unconscious impulse illustrate the use of psychological concepts for judging so-called mental health and illness. The idea that chronic hostility, vengefulness, or divorce are indicative of mental illness would be illustrations of the use of ethical norms, that is to say, the desirability of love, kindness, and a stable marriage relationship. Finally, the widespread psychiatric opinion that only a mentally ill person would commit homicide illustrates the use of legal concept as a norm of mental health, the norm from which deviation is measured whenever one speaks of a mental illness is a psychosocial and ethical one. Yet the remedy is sought in terms of medical measures which, it is hoped and assumed, are free from wide differences of ethical value. The definition of the disorder and the terms in which it is remedied are sought and therefore are at serious odds with one another. The practical significance of this covert conflict between the alleged nature of the defect and the remedy can hardly be exaggerated. Having identified the norms to measure deviations in cases of mental illness, we will now turn to the question, who defines norms and hence the deviation? Two basic answers may be offered. A. It is the person himself, that is, the patient, who decides that he deviates from the norm. For example, an artist may believe that he suffers from a work inhibition and that he may implement this conclusion by seeking help for himself from a psychotherapist. B. It may be someone other than the patient who decides that the latter is a deviant, for example, relatives, physicians, legal authorities, or society in general. In such cases, a psychiatrist may be hired by others to do something to the patient in order to correct the deviation. These considerations underscore the importance of asking the question, whose agent is the psychiatrist, and of giving a candid answer to it. The psychiatrist, psychologist, or non-medical psychotherapist it now develops may be the agent of the patient, of the relatives, of the school, of the military services, of a business organization, of a law court, and so forth. In speaking the psychiatrist as the agent of these persons or organizations, it is not implied that his values concerning norms or his ideas and aims concerning the proper nature of remedial action need to coincide exactly with those of his employer. For example, a patient in individual psychotherapy may believe that his salvation lies in a new marriage. His psychotherapist need not share this hypothesis. As the patient's agent, however, he must abstain from bringing social or legal force to bear on the patient which would prevent him from putting his beliefs into action. If his contract with the patient, the psychotherapist or psychiatrist may disagree with him or stop his treatment, but he cannot engage others to obstruct the patient's aspirations. Similarly, if a psychiatrist is engaged to a court to determine the sanity of a criminal, he need not fully share the legal authority's values and intentions in regard to the criminal and the means available for dealing with him. But the psychiatrist is expressly barred from stating, for example, that it is not the criminal who is insane, but the man who wrote the laws on the basis of which the very actions are being judged and regarded as criminal. Such an opinion would be voiced, of course, but not in a courtroom, and not by a psychiatrist who makes it his practice to assist the court by performing its daily work. To recapitulate, an actual contemporary social usage, the finding of mental illness is made by establishing a deviance in behavior from a certain psychosocial, ethical, or legal norm. The judgment may be made, as in medicine, by the patient, by the physician, psychiatrist, or others. Remedial action finally tends to be sought in a therapeutic or covertly medical framework, thus creating a situation in which psychosocial, ethical, and or legal deviations are claimed to be correctable by so-called medical action. Since medical action is designed to correct only medical deviations, it seems logically absurd to expect that it will help solve problems whose very existence had been defined and established on non-medical grounds. Szasz thinks that these considerations may be fruitfully applied to the present use of tranquilizers and more generally to what might be expected of drugs of whatever type in regard to the amelioration or solution of problems of human being. The role of ethics in psychiatry. Anything that people do, in contrast to the things that happen to them, takes place in the context of value. In this broad sense, no human activity is devoid of ethical implications. When the values underlying certain activities are widely shared, those who participate in their pursuit may lose sight of them altogether. The discipline of medicine, both as a pure science, for example research, and as a technology, for example therapy, contain many ethical considerations and judgments. Unfortunately, these are often denied, minimalized, or kept out of focus, for the idea of the medical profession as well as the people whom it serves seemed to be having a system of medicine allegedly free from ethical value. This sentimental notion is expressed by such things as the doctor's willingness to treat and help patients irrespective of their religious or political beliefs, whether they are rich or poor, etc. While there may be some ground for this belief, albeit it is a view that is not impressively true in these regards, the fact remains that ethical considerations encompass a vast range of human affairs. By making the practice of medicine neutral in this regard to some specific issues of value need not and cannot mean that it can be free from such values. The practice of medicine is intimately tied to ethics, and the first thing we must do, according to Szasz, is to try and clear this up explicitly. Szasz lets the matter rest here, for it does not concern us specifically in the essay. Lest there be any vagueness, however, about how or where ethics in medicine meet, Szasz reminds us, the reader, of such issues such as birth control, abortion, suicide, and euthanasia as only a few of the major areas of the current ethomedical controversy. Psychiatry, he submits, is very much more intimately tied with problems of ethics than it is medicine. The use of the word psychiatry here refers to the contemporary discipline in which it is concerned with the problems of living, and not with diseases of the brain, which are problems for neurology. Problems in human relations can be analysed, interpreted, and given meaning only within given social and ethical contexts. Accordingly, it does make a difference, arguments to the contrary notwithstanding, what the psychiatrist's social ethical orientation may happen to be, for these will influence his ideas on what is wrong with the patient, what deserves comment or interpretation, in what possible directions change might be desirable, and so forth. Even in medicine proper, these factors play a role, as for instance in the divergent orientations with physicians, depending on their religious affiliations, have towards such things as birth control and therapeutic abortion. Can anyone really believe that the psychotherapist's idea concerning religious beliefs, slavery, or other similar issues play no role in his practical work? If they do make a difference, what are we to infer from it? Does it not seem reasonable that we ought to have different psychiatric therapies, each expressly recognized for the ethical positions in which they embody, for, say, Catholics and Jews, religious persons and agnostics, Democrats and communists, and so on? Indeed, if we look at how psychiatry actually practiced, say, in the United States, we find that people do seek psychiatric help in accordance with their social status and ethical beliefs. This should not really surprise us more than being told that practicing Catholics rarely frequent birth control clinics. The foregoing position, which holds that contemporary psychotherapists deal with problems in living rather than with mental illnesses and their cures, stands in opposition to the current prevalent claim, according to which mental illness is just as real and objective as bodily illness. This is a confusing claim, since it is never known exactly what is meant by words such as real and objective. It is suspected, however, that what is intended by the proponents of this view is to create the idea in the popular mind that mental illness is some sort of disease entity, like an infection or a malignancy. If this were true, one could catch or get a mental illness, one might have or harbor it, one might transmit it to others, and finally one could get rid of it. It is Szasz's opinion that there is not a shred of evidence to support this idea. To the contrary, all the evidence is the other way and supports the view that what people now call mental illnesses are for the most part communications expressing unacceptable ideas, often framed moreover from an unusual idiom. The scope of this essay allows Szasz to do no more than to mention the alternative theoretical approach to the problem. This is not the place to consider in detail the similarities and differences between bodily and mental illnesses. It shall suffice for us here to emphasize only the important difference between them, namely that whereas bodily disease refers to public psychochemical occurrences, the notion of mental illness is usually to codify relatively more private psychosocial happenings of which the observer or diagnostician form a part. In other words, the psychiatrist does not stand apart from what he observes, but is, in Harry Stack Sullivan's apt words, a participant observer. This means that he is committed to some picture of what he considers reality, and to what he thinks society considers reality, and he observes and judges the patient's behavior in the light of these considerations. This touches on our earlier observation that the notion of mental symptom itself implies a comparison between observer and observed, psychiatrist and patient. This is so obvious that it may be charged with belaboring trivialities. Szasz once again says that his aim in presenting this argument was expressly to criticize and counter a prevailing contemporary tendency to deny the moral aspects of psychiatry and psychotherapy and substitute them for an allegedly value-free medical considerations. Psychotherapy, for example, is being widely practiced as though it entailed nothing other than the restoring the patient from a state of mental sickness to one of mental health. While it is generally accepted that the mental illness has something to do with a man's social or interpersonal relations, it is paradoxically maintained that problems of values, that is, of ethics, do not arise from this process. Freud went so far as to say, "I consider ethics to be taken for granted. Actually, I have never done a mean thing." This surely is a strange thing to say for someone who has studied man as a social being as closely as Freud. Szasz mentions here that it is to show the notion of illness in the case of the psychoanalysis, the psychopathy, or mental illness was used by Freud and by most of his followers as a means of classifying certain forms of human behavior as falling within the scope of medicine and, hence, by fiat, outside of ethics. Yet in one sense, much of psychotherapy may revolve around nothing more than the euclidation and weighing of goals and values, many of which may be mutually contradictory, and the means whereby they might be best harmonized, realized, or relinquished. The diversity of human values and the methods by means of which they can be realized is so vast, and many of them remain so unacknowledged, that they cannot fail but lead to conflicts in human relations. Indeed, to say that human relations at all levels, from a mother to a child, through husband and wife to nation and nation, are fraught with stress, strain, and disharmony is once again making the obvious explicit. Yet what may be obvious may also be poorly understood. For Szasz, this is the case here, for it seems to him that, at least in our scientific theories of behavior, we have failed to accept the simple fact that human relations are inherently fraught with difficulties, and that to make them even relatively harmonious requires much patience and hard work. Szasz submits that the idea of mental illness is now being put to work to obscure certain difficulties which at present may be inherent, not that they need be unmodifiable, in the social intercourse of persons. If this is true, the concept functions as a disguise for, instead of calling attention to conflicting human needs, aspirations, and values, the notion of mental illness provides an amoral and impersonal thing, an illness, as an explanation for the problems in living. We may recall in this connection that not so long ago it was devils and witches who were held responsible for men's problems in social living. The belief in mental illness is something other than man's trouble in getting along with his fellow man. It's the proper heir to the belief in demonology and witchcraft. Mental illness exists or is real in exactly the same sense in which witches existed or were real. Choices, responsibility, and psychiatry. While Szasz has argued that mental illnesses do not exist, he obviously did not imply that the social and psychological occurrences to which this label is currently being attached also do not exist. Like the personal and social troubles people had in the Middle Ages, they are real enough. It is the label we give them that concerns us, and having labeled them, what do we do about them? While Szasz cannot go into the ramified implications of this problem in this essay, it is worth noting that the demonological conception of problems in living gave rise to the therapy along theological lines. Today, a belief in mental illness implies, nay requires, therapy along with medical or psychotherapeutic lines. What is implied in the new line of thought set forth here is something quite different. Szasz does not intend to offer a new conception of psychiatric illness nor a form of therapy. His aim is more modest and yet also more ambitious. It is to suggest that the phenomena now called mental illness be looked at afresh and more simple, that it be removed from the category of illness, and that it should be regarded as the expression of man's struggle with the problems of how he should live. The last of these problems mentioned is obviously a vast one, its enormity reflecting not only man's inability to cope with his environment, but even more, his increasing self-reflectiveness. By problems in living, then, Szasz refers to that truly explosive chain reaction which began with man's fall from divine grace by partaking of the fruit of the tree of knowledge. Man's awareness of himself and of the world around him seems to be steadily expanding, bringing in its wake an ever larger burden of understanding. This burden then is to be expected and must not be misinterpreted. Our only rational means for lightening it is more understanding, and appropriate action based on such understanding. The main alternative lies in acting as though the burden were not what in fact we perceive it to be, and taking refuge in an outmoded theological view of man. In the latter view, man does not fashion his life and much of his world about him, but merely lives out his fate in a world created by superior beings. This may logically lead to pleading non-responsibility in the face of seemingly unfathomable problems and difficulties. Yet if man fails to take increasing responsibility for his actions individually as well as collectively, it seems unlikely that some higher power or being would assume this task and carry on the burden for him. Moreover, it seems hardly the proper time in human history for obscuring the issue of man's responsibility for his actions by hiding it behind the skirt of an all-explaining concept of mental illness. Conclusions. Szasz has tried to show that the notion of mental illness has outlived whatever usefulness it might have had, and that it now functions merely as a convenient myth. As such, it is a true heir to the religious beliefs in general, and to the belief in witchcraft in particular. The role of all these belief systems was to act as social tranquilizers, thus encouraging the hope that mastery of certain specific problems may be achieved by means of a substitutive, symbolic magical operations. The notion of mental illness thus serves mainly to obscure the everyday fact that life for most people is a continuous struggle, not for biological survival, but for a place in the sun, peace of mind, or some other human value. For man aware of himself and of the world around him, once the needs for preserving the body and perhaps the race are more or less satisfied, the problem arises of what to do with himself. Sustained adherence to the myth of mental illness allows people to avoid facing this problem, believing that mental health, conceived as the absence of mental illness, automatically ensures the making of right and safe choices in the conduct of one's life. But the facts are the other way. It is the making of good choices in life that others regard retrospectively as good mental health. The myth of mental illness encourages us, moreover, to believe in its logical corollary, that social intercourse would be harmonious, satisfying, and the basis of a good life if it were not for the disrupting influences of mental illnesses or psychopathy. The potentiality for universal human happiness, in this form at least, seems to Szasz to be another example of the "I wish it were true" type fantasy. Szasz believes that human happiness or well-being on a hitherto unimaginably large scale, and not just for a select few, is possible. This goal would be achieved, however, only at the cost of many men, and not just a few willing and able to tackle their own personal, social, and ethical conflicts. This means having the courage and integrity to forego waging battles on false fronts, finding solutions for substitute problems. For instance, fighting the battle of stomach acid and chronic fatigue instead of facing up to a marital conflict. Our adversaries are not demons, witches, fate, or mental illness. We have no enemy whom we can fight, exercise, or dispel by cure. What we do have are problems in living, whether these be biologic, economic, political, or social-psychological. In this essay, Szasz was concerned only with the problems belonging in the last mentioned category, and within this group mainly with those pertaining to moral values. The field to which modern psychiatry addresses itself is vast, and Szasz made no effort to encompass it all. His argument was limited to the proposition that mental illness is a myth, whose function is to disguise and thus render more palatable the bitter pill of moral conflicts in human relations. And with that, we come to the end of this episode. I hope you enjoyed it. If you do, please be sure to hit the like button, subscribe, hit the notification bell so that you never miss an episode, and be sure to join us over on Patreon, where we get early access and other goodies are available for various tiers. And with that, that leaves me only to say thank you very much for listening, and that I will wish you a good day, good night, wherever, whenever, whatever you happen to be, and I hope you will join us for another episode very soon.